Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Allison from the University of California, San Diego. I just came from an exciting session on physical activity, and I have Dr. Andrea LaCroix, also from the University of California, San Diego, where she presented results from the OPACH Study, which is a study of physical activity among women. Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about this study, the OPACH Study?
The OPACH Study stands for Objective Physical Activity and Cardiovascular Health in older women, and it's a sub-cohort of the Women's Health Initiative. There's about 6,400 women who wore accelerometers, and what we presented today was the data on the number of steps that they took per day in relation to cardiovascular mortality. And the reason we did that was to follow up on suggestions from the Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee in 2018 that learning more about steps might help us to translate physical activity findings better to the public.
Tell us a little more about the design of the study.
It's a prospective cohort study, and we collected the accelerometer measurements in 2012 to 2014, and we followed these women until 2019 in the data we presented today, which is very, very recent. So 5 to 7 years of follow-up available now. We had almost 1,000 deaths occur during this period. These women were aged 63 to 99 at the beginning. And we have about 560 cardiovascular deaths and around 360 incident major cardiovascular diagnoses. That's stroke, heart attacks, and CVD death, amongst those who didn't have a heart attack or stroke at the beginning.
Sounds like a very robust study population. Can you tell us what your original impetus was for doing this trial or this study?
Well, the original impetus was that we had a lot of data on physical activity and heart disease showing that self-reported physical activity was strongly associated with decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. But we were also aware that self-reports of physical activity, like the sports that you play in, how often you take walks, may not capture all of the movement that you're doing. And so what happened was the technology became available about 10 years ago to start wearing accelerometers, which is like it's like a more technologically sophisticated version of a Fitbit, research-grade accelerometers, so that we could learn about all these different kinds of physical activity. And in OPACH, because the women are older, we're especially interested in the lower intensity physical activities that never got studied well with self-reported questionnaires, like light physical activity, like daily life movement, which is a descriptor we use for the kind of activity you do when you wake up in the morning and you start getting ready for your day, you get dressed. Later on, you may check the mail, you're ambling around, you're gardening, you're doing stuff, and none of this is typically counted in our questionnaires as an important source of physical activity. It turns out that most of us have several hours a day of that kind of activity that we're doing, and it's shown to be importantly related to reduced risk of cardiovascular disease.
Sounds like a very worthy study design and worthy study to do. What did you find?
Well, today what I presented, and I do want to emphasize that it's the women in this cohort, these 6,400 women who have taught us so clearly these things that I'm about to speak about. One thing we learned was that the average number of steps was around 3,500 in these women, so quite a bit less than the 10,000 we're always hearing about. The upper quartile started with 4,500 steps and goes up to a little more than 10,000, but very few women in the cohort got more than about 7,500 steps, very few. What we found in the study was there was an 18% reduced risk of cardiovascular mortality for every 1,000 steps, and a 7% reduced risk of incident major cardiovascular disease for every 1,000 steps. That translates into, for the upper quartile versus the lowest quartile, a 38% reduced risk of cardiovascular mortality for the women in the top quartile versus the bottom. We also learned that we were able to disaggregate light intensity steps from moderate vigorous intensity steps, and the dose-response association between number of steps and cardiovascular mortality looked very, very similar for light and moderate vigorous steps. And in fact, the hazard ratios showed a stronger association with light steps than with moderate vigorous steps. Maybe not statistically different, but there was no evidence that it was more important to take moderate vigorous physical activity steps. And the other thing I wanted to remark on is, as opposed to the paper that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine last year, it looks to us in the OPACH data like the strongest association is observed in women getting 4,500 or more steps, whereas in this previous report with total mortality, it was more like 7,500. So we think that getting 4,500 or 5,000 steps, and there's a steep association between very few steps and getting to that point, showing benefit all along the way. We think that it's possible to reduce your risk of cardiovascular mortality, getting any steps above zero. First, I want to say that every step is a good step, and it looks like if you get 4,500, 5,000, 6,000 steps, you've done as much good with stepping as you possibly can. The last thing I'll comment on is that we saw in the data that there were many women getting light intensity physical activity and daily life movement in that lowest category of steps, so women with less than 2,000 steps. So we know the accelerometer is not capturing all of the steps at the very low end. And we think the most important message from this work is that we encourage people to, be on their feet moving as much as possible. And it's not so important the actual number of steps, but to be not sitting, to be interrupting your sitting as frequently as possible. Light activity is great. Everything you do counts, and you should pat yourself on the back every single time you stand up and go somewhere, whether it's whether it's across the room or to the mailbox, or for a 5-mile hike on the trails at the beach. It all counts.
So thank you, Dr. LaCroix, for this important contribution to women's aging and women's health.
Thank you, Dr. Allison.